In this AMT Insight, I'm going to explain how the decarbonisation agenda has really transformed aluminium's fundamental narrative in a very positive way. Now, if we look at market conditions since March 2020, since the onset of the pandemic, we can see that aluminium price has really been in a fairly strong and consistent bull market uptrend, which is still quite valid today. Outside China, demand last year was hit very hard last year, largely because of the impacts of a big reduction of about 16% in the automotive sector. That's according to estimates by CRU. However, packaging and durable goods demand remained pretty strong for aluminium, and China performed a bit better with consumption up about 4% last year because of its earlier recovery from the pandemic. I think what you've seen as we've come into 2021 is that the ex-China recovery has really started to take over in terms of the key demand driver globally, as Chinese growth has moderated a little. Although we're still seeing, CRU still sees a 7% growth in Chinese consumption this year and 12% outside China. So there's an improved fundamental outlook and improved demand outlook for this year. Now, the big shift that we've seen since the beginning of this year, really, in terms of in the aluminium narrative, has been the impact of decarbonisation. So the US, Europe and China have all developed decarbonisation and cemented it as really a core policy objective over the next 10, 20 years. And the real implications of that are a real drive to reduce fossil fuel use. That's through, for example, a transition to electric vehicles, transition to renewable energy, and reducing power consumption, particularly from heavy industries. Now, aluminium is likely to be impacted by this quite significantly, both on the supply and the demand side. If we start with the supply side, aluminium is a very energy-intensive industry, producing aluminium is, and so there's a pressure really to decarbonise there because it represents about 2% of global carbon emissions. You've already seen the impact of that in China. They've, by the quite strong curbs on Inner Mongolia's output in terms of reducing energy consumption. And although this year I think we're still seeing an incentive in China to boost production capacity because of the higher prices, there is a hard cap of 45 million tonnes that could be hit inside China by 2022, 2023. And beyond that, it becomes quite difficult for China to keep expanding its growth to keep up with consumption. So China is likely to push to recycle, probably pushing its aluminium recycling as a target towards 30% from currently, where it's probably below 25%. And Rusal has estimated that secondary production growth could be 9% a year in China by 2030. So there's some big drivers there. I think the implications of that are that China is likely to remain a net importer, as has been the case since the onset of the pandemic, because of this reduction constraint on supply. It will probably look to invest in other sources of supply in other countries and then import that metal into the country. Last year you saw a big boom in imports, obviously because China recovered a bit faster, and I think this year we may see some moderation in its scale of imports as the national stockpile sales that have been announced kind of feed through every month. That could dampen import demand, and also because of this role of ex-China in driving demand now, there's perhaps more incentive to keep metal outside China to cater to that rather than import it into China. Now, the other side of the coin really on the decarbonisation agenda is green demand. So obviously there is a huge amount of shifts economically and in economies related to this decarbonisation agenda, and one part of that will be a shift to electric vehicles. And within electric vehicles, the amount of aluminium used is quite a bit higher, and that's because they want to lightweight these vehicles and make them more energy efficient, to use electricity, increase the range, and because of that, that's going to be a big driver for aluminium consumption. I think Rusal has estimated that you could see a 3.7% compound annual growth rate in aluminium demand to 2025 because of these kind of trends globally. And also, if you think about the power grid and the solar and renewable sector, that's also a driver for aluminium demand. And I think that could be particularly the case if the copper price soars and people are perhaps looking to substitute that out a little bit as well. So there's plenty of possibilities there on the demand side. So in terms of the outlook, going back to this original chart, I think the general anticipation is that the market is going to remain close to balanced in 2021, perhaps in a small surplus. and that's probably a pullback from estimations of a larger surplus that people were talking about at the back end of last year, because there's a more restrained forecast on what China's aluminium production capacity and growth is going to be this year. And that's all down again to this decarbonisation agenda. So that's going to constrain supply growth. It's likely to boost demand growth in some of these new technologies and areas where the investment's going to go in for the EV transition, again, as an example. And I think overall, if we're looking ahead, next few months, I think it's still important you look at the chart to see that we are still in a technical bull market. Although I think it's important to recognise that there are now some growing risks in terms of the ongoing spread of the pandemic in countries with low vaccinations, from the recent rebound in the US dollar strength we've seen, and very much linked to that, the role and uncertainty around monetary policy that has obviously been very loose for the last 2 years and has been a strong driver of demand growth globally and investment and fiscal stimulus. But there's uncertainty about when that will be dialed back as well. So some macro risks to consider as well.